Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. In today's video, we're going to follow Tu Tien and Jack from a terrifying warning at a small rural clinic, through a tense trip to a big hospital in Hanoi, to the unexpected moment when one sentence from the doctor turns all their fear into the happiest news of their lives. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. After the harsh warning at the small rural clinic, fear settled deep in Tu Tien's chest. The doctor hadn't given a clear answer, only, "It could be serious. You should go to Hanoi." Those words echoed all night. Every strange flutter in her body felt dangerous. She lay awake in the dark, barely blinking. Beside her, Jack pretended to sleep but watched her quietly. When he saw her wipe away a tear, he couldn't stay still. He reached under the blanket and took her hand. "Tien," he whispered, "tomorrow I'll drive you to Hanoi. Whatever they say, we'll face it together." "I'm not afraid of the road," she said softly. "I'm afraid of what they'll tell us." Her voice shook. Jack squeezed her fingers. "Not knowing is worse," he replied. "If something is wrong, we treat it. If nothing is wrong, you can finally breathe again. Either way, you won't be alone." Morning came gray and heavy. Jack got up early and began packing a small bag. He folded a dress for her, added her scarf, the papers from the rural clinic, a bottle of water, biscuits, and a light sweater. When he turned back, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, hands clenched together. "Do we really have to go all the way to Hanoi?" she asked. He sat beside her. "We do," he said gently. "I'd rather drive you there and hear she's fine than stay here and watch you keep worrying. I can't stand seeing you scared like this." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Then we go." In the kitchen, Mrs. Loy had been awake since before dawn. She rinsed rice, sliced ginger, and put a pot of chow gung on the stove. The warm, sharp smell filled the house as she stirred. With every turn of the spoon, she silently prayed that this trip would end in good news. Anxiety made her move faster than usual. Uncle Dung arrived just as Jack brought the bag out. One look at their faces told him everything. "So it's today," he said quietly. Jack nodded. "We're going to the big hospital in Hanoi. They'll have better tests there." Without another question, Uncle Dung checked the water jars, set a kettle to boil, and laid a clean towel on the table. Then he pulled a small envelope of money from his pocket and placed it next to the kettle. "For extra tests and medicine," he said. "City hospitals always ask for something. If you don't use it, bring it back." Mrs. Loy's eyes grew wet. "You're a good uncle," she murmured. He waved off the compliment. "She's like my own child. I can't walk beside them today, but I can at least do this." When it was time to leave, the yard was washed in soft morning light. The cassava field glistened with dew. The half-finished garden stood quiet, tools leaning against the fence. Jack started the car, listened to the engine, then turned it off and went back for Tu Tien. "Sit in the back so you can stretch out," he told her. "If you feel dizzy, you can lie down." She moved carefully, more from fear than weakness. Jack helped her into the back seat, placed a pillow behind her, and spread a light blanket over her legs. At the gate, Mrs. Loy came forward, wiping her hands on her apron. She leaned in through the open door, cupping Tu Tien's face. "Listen to the doctors," she said. "If they tell you to rest, you rest. Don't argue. Don't worry about the house. I'll handle everything." Yes, Mom, Tu Tien replied, eyes shining. Jack added, I'll call as soon as we hear anything. You'd better, Mrs. Loy sniffed, trying to joke. If you forget, I'll march to Hanoi myself. They all managed a shaky laugh. Uncle Dung patted the roof of the car. Drive slowly, he warned. If you're tired, stop. Arriving safe is more important than arriving fast. Jack nodded and climbed into the driver's seat. The farmhouse, fields, and half-built garden slowly shrank in the mirrors as they pulled away. Inside the car, they left the radio off. The only sounds were the engine and passing traffic. After a while, Jack reached one hand back without looking and found hers. You okay? He asked. A little lightheaded, she said, but I'll manage. He adjusted the air vent so it didn't blow directly on her and cracked the window to let in fresh air. The landscape outside slowly changed from wide fields to crowded streets. Motorbikes appeared, then buses, then taller buildings. I'm sorry, Jack said suddenly. I should have noticed sooner how worried you were. I thought you were just tired from work and the heat. It's not just you, she answered. I didn't tell you everything. I kept hoping it would go away. I didn't want to sound dramatic. Jack shook his head. From now on, be dramatic, he said. Wake me up, cry, complain. I'd rather hear too much than too little. A small smile touched her lips. Don't regret those words later, she whispered. If it means you're still here to wake me, he replied. I won't. By the time they reached Hanoi, the traffic was thick and noisy. The hospital was a big white building full of windows and people. Jack parked, helped her out carefully, and walked beside her through the entrance. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of disinfectant. They handed the referral papers to the nurse at the counter, answered quick questions, and received a small numbered ticket. Please wait over there, the nurse said, pointing to a row of plastic chairs. The waiting room was crowded and restless. Babies cried, old men coughed, women fanned themselves with folded documents. Every time a door opened and a name or number was called, shoulders stiffened across the room. Jack and Tu Tien found 2 seats together. She sat with the ticket clutched in both hands, eyes fixed on the blinking board. Do you want some water? Jack asked. She shook her head. Maybe later. He didn't push. He simply took her hand again and held on. His thumb traced small circles on her palm, steady and warm. Surrounded by strangers and hospital noise, they sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting for their number and whatever answer waited behind that door. The number on their ticket finally appeared on the screen with a soft beep. Jack leaned forward, checked twice, then touched Tu Tien's arm. That's us, he said quietly. Her legs felt stiff as she stood. Jack stayed close, one hand at her back. The hallway to the exam room was bright and white. At the door, Jack knocked and pushed it open. Inside, the room was simple and clean. A desk, a computer, a bed, and an ultrasound machine in the corner. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with calm eyes, looked up from a file. You must be Mrs. Tu, she said, glancing at the referral papers. Please, sit down. They sat. Jack could feel Tu Tien's hand trembling in his. The doctor read the documents from the rural clinic, then nodded slowly. So, she said, you've been feeling dizzy, nauseous, and very tired. And the clinic doctor was worried something serious might be going on? Yes, Tu Tien answered, barely above a whisper. He just told me to come here quickly. He didn't explain much. The doctor nodded. All right, we'll do some basic tests and an ultrasound. That'll tell us more than guessing. Try not to panic before we know what's actually happening, okay? Tu Tien swallowed and nodded. Jack squeezed her fingers. We're ready, he said. The doctor helped Tu Tien onto the bed and switched on the ultrasound machine. The gel felt cold on her skin. Jack moved to her side so she could see his face. His heart was pounding as hard as hers. For a few long seconds, the only sound was the soft hum of the machine. The doctor's eyes stayed on the screen, serious and focused. To Tu Tien, that silence felt endless. "Doctor," she whispered, "is it bad?" The doctor didn't answer right away. Slowly, her expression softened, and a small smile appeared. "Take a look," she said gently, turning the screen so they could see. "Do you see this little shape here?" Jack leaned in, staring at the fuzzy image. Tu Tien lifted her head, eyes wide. On the monitor, a tiny, flickering point of light glowed. "This," the doctor continued, voice warm, "is a pregnancy. You're expecting a baby. It's still early, but right now, I don't see anything dangerous." For a moment, the words didn't land. Then the meaning reached them. "Pregnant?" Tu Tien breathed. "I'm really pregnant?" "Yes," the doctor confirmed. "Congratulations." Tears rushed to Tu Tien's eyes. All the fear and sleepless nights cracked open at once. A shaky laugh slipped out between her sobs. Jack's hand went to his mouth, his eyes suddenly bright. "She's not sick," he said hoarsely. "She's carrying our baby." "That's right," the doctor replied. "Some of your symptoms are normal early pregnancy signs, but early pregnancy is delicate. You need rest, good food, and regular checkups. If you feel strong pain, heavy bleeding, or fainting, you must come back immediately." Tu Tien nodded, wiping her cheeks. "I'll be careful, I promise." Jack looked from the screen to his wife, trying to absorb everything. "Can we get a picture?" he asked quietly. "Of the ultrasound?" The doctor smiled. "Of course." She clicked a few buttons, printed a small black and white image, and handed it to him. Jack held it like it might break. When the exam was over, she helped Tu Tien sit up and repeated the basics. Vitamins, light meals, no heavy lifting, less stress, schedule the next appointment. "The signs you had before aren't dangerous at the moment," she said. "But you must listen to your body and not push yourself." "We'll make sure of it," Jack replied. Out in the hallway again, the hospital felt different. The lights seemed softer, the noise less sharp. Jack walked beside Tu Tien, the ultrasound photo still in his hand. "Let's sit for a minute," he suggested, guiding her to a bench near a window. Sunlight warmed their feet. He handed her the picture. She stared at it, fingertips tracing the tiny shape. "This little dot is really inside me?" she murmured. "Yeah," Jack said, voice thick. "Our little dot." She laughed through fresh tears. "For days I was scared something inside me was ending," she said quietly. "But it turns out someone else was quietly beginning." Jack's throat tightened. He put his arm around her shoulders. "Next time you feel something is wrong, you tell me right away," he whispered. "No more carrying that fear alone." She nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "No more alone." A moment later, Jack pulled out his phone. "We should call Mom," he said. "If we wait any longer, she'll walk here herself." "Call her," Tu Tien agreed. He dialed. The call barely rang once before Mrs. Loy picked up. "Jack, how is she?" Her voice was tight. "Mom," he said softly, looking at Tu Tien with the photo in her hands. "She's okay, and She's pregnant." There was silence, then a sharp inhale. A sob burst out, half laughter, half relief. "Pregnant?" Mrs. Loy repeated, voice shaking. "Really?" "Really," Jack confirmed. "The doctor says it's early, but everything looks okay for now. She needs rest and checkups, but it's not what we were afraid of." In the background, they heard a chair scrape and Uncle Dung's voice. "What is it? What did they say?" "She's pregnant!" Mrs. Loy shouted, joy spilling out. "Our girl is pregnant!" Uncle Dung let out a cheer. "I knew it!" he boomed. "Tell them to come home. The porridge is ready." Jack laughed. "We'll head back soon," he promised. "Get the bowls ready." "Drive carefully," Mrs. Loy said quickly, then softer. "Thank you, heaven." When the call ended, the hallway felt warmer. Jack turned back to Tu Tien, who was watching him with a quiet smile. "They're happy," she said. "They've been waiting for this almost as long as we have," he replied. He stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, Mom-to-be. Let's take our little Dot home." The drive back felt shorter. This time, the silence in the car was soft and full. Every now and then, Jack glanced in the mirror and saw Tu Tien looking at the ultrasound photo again, as if afraid it might disappear. "From now on," he said at one point, voice gentle but firm. "No more going to clinics or hospitals by yourself. Wherever you go, I go. Promise?" She met his eyes in the mirror and smiled. "I promise. And thank you, Jack." He shook his head. "No," he answered. "Thank you for giving us this tiny miracle." As the farmhouse and half-finished garden finally came into view, fear no longer led the way. Hope rode home with them instead, held in a small black and white picture, and in the quiet promise that from this day on, she would never have to walk through that kind of fear alone again. After a frightening warning at a small rural clinic, Tu Tien spends a sleepless night fearing the worst about her health. Jack insists on driving her to a big hospital in Hanoi, determined to face whatever comes together. At home, Mrs. Loy cooks ginger porridge and prays, while Uncle Dung prepares money just in case. Everyone quietly bracing for bad news. The crowded city hospital and long wait only deepen their anxiety until an ultrasound finally reveals the truth. Tu Tien isn't seriously ill. She's pregnant. Shock, relief, and joy wash over them as Jack clutches the tiny ultrasound photo and calls home. On speaker, Mrs. Loy cries and laughs at the same time, and Uncle Dung cheers from the background. Driving back, Jack gently promises that from now on, Tu Tien will never go to any clinic or hospital alone again.